Hello, my name is Tim Lutz. I'm the superintendent of the Bemidji Area School District, and I'm here to share a presentation on the operating referendum that the district is running right now. And if you're watching this presentation, I would like to thank you very much for taking the time and for being interested in finding answers as to why the district is seeking an operating referendum. During a normal year, we would have many in-person meetings, community forums, and townhouse type sessions so that we could provide this information to people in real live settings. But because of COVID-19, most of our meetings have had to be virtual like this one. So again, thank you for joining us and watching this video. And I have about 13 to 15 minutes of slides to share with you. And then after that, we have some time for some frequently asked questions about the referendum. So I'll get started just by saying that one of our mottos or mantras during this time of the referendum is that we want to secure our financial future. And that's what we're about. We want to make sure that the success stories of ISD 31 continue. And we do have a lot of success stories, which I'll get into in just a little bit. But one thing that I would like to point out is that you, as a member of ISD 31's community, as a parent or a teacher or a community member, you are a very important member of our team and of our audience and of our support matrix. So I would like to thank you for your support of Bemidji area schools. It is all of us working together in our community that makes us successful, and a successful school district leads to a successful and thriving community. What we want to do is build on our many successes. We have a lot of success stories, and I won't read all of these, but you can see the very first item is that the high school is consistently named as one of the nation's best high schools by US News and World Report. We have the amazing Bemidji High School Career Academies. We have award-winning show choirs. We have STEAM and STEM programs across the district. Basically, we have a lot of success stories, and our goal in reaching out with this operating referendum is to be able to build on our successes. And I could provide many more slides that show our successes, but I think you get the picture already. So our most important audience is you, and here are what some of you in the community have been saying about the school district. And many of these comments were made during last spring when we were in distance learning because of the pandemic. The last statement there by a district student who was a senior girl really touched me. She thought she had lost the last part of her senior year because of distance learning. But when we had graduation, the way we held it with the drive-through setting, she was amazed at how powerful that experience was. And she reached out and thanked the school district for the way that graduation was handled. Now she has a lot of great memories to share someday with her friends and with her children and even her grandchildren someday. So let's get into the real details about how schools are funded in Minnesota. In this state, we receive funding from the federal government, which is about 5 or 6% of our overall budget. Another 12 to 13% comes from local levies and taxes, and the rest comes from state aid that's required for different purposes. So about 80 to 82% comes from state funding formulas. And it gets to be kind of confusing, but that funding formula takes care of about 80% of that state amount. So 80% of around 80%. So about 60% overall comes from a per pupil formula, which is around $6,500 per student. But unfortunately, as you can see in the middle arrow, many of those dollars depend upon certain formulas, and they dictate whether or not a district is eligible for some of the funding. And it a lot of times depends upon whether or not students qualify for some of that funding, and then how much per student. So it's not always guaranteed that we will have that particular amount within the formula for each student. Finally, at the bottom, you can see that many of our dollars are restricted, and they are supposed to go into certain funding streams or budgets. For example, special education, early education programs, and some of our gifted and talented excellence programs. Those programs are all required, but they're almost always not funded enough to take care of those programs. So they're most of the time in the red, leaving us with the difficult situation of having to subsidize those programs from our general fund. So it's very confusing, and many of these dollars are tied up in very specific situations and purposes. Something I want to point out is that every year the state legislature takes a look at inflation and tries to keep up with it, but it has not done so for the last 15 years. In fact, some years we weren't able to even receive a 2% bump in our inflation. There were some lean years there where we received 1% or nothing in terms of an increase. And when we do receive an increase, that increase, let's say 2%, is only applied to that portion of the state funding, which is only about 55 to 60% of our budget. So what that means is when inflation is 2%, it affects all of our budget of $67.5 million. But when we receive 2% to keep up with that inflation, that 2% only is applied to about half to 60% of our budget. So really, it's only about a 1% increase. So as you can see in the blue box there, when adjusted for inflation and for pupil weighting and new state requirements, we are behind. Our state funding has declined actually over the last 14 years. And that is one of the major reasons that we are going out for an operating referendum at this time, because we are worse off than we were a decade and a half ago. I'm happy to report that we use most of our funding in the classroom. Over 2/3 of our budget goes into teachers and support staff and curriculum, books, materials, computers, all of the things that students need to thrive and do well and to learn in the classroom. You can see on the right side where some of the other percentages are: 4% for administration, 11% for transportation and other people services, 14% to keep our buildings and grounds safe and well lit and clean and healthy. But the good news is most of our money goes into the classroom. I want to point out a few challenges that we have in rural school districts. Bemidji is rural, even though we are a regional center. If you look at the top of the wheel in the yellow, we have a problem with the formula that addresses busing and transportation. You would think that a simple formula of around $450 per student on a bus would work in any school district in the state. It does work very well in big cities or in the metro area, where there are tightly packed neighborhoods and high-rise buildings, and maybe they have 200 square miles in their district's geography. And when 20 buses pick up these students, and a bus might stop at a corner and pick up a dozen students from a neighborhood, and then drive a couple blocks and pick up 10 more students from a high-rise building. And before long, that bus is full, and the bus can then drop students off. That formula works for a metro school district like that, but it does not work very well in Bemidji, where we have a very large rural geography or geographic area. We have 824 square miles in our school district. We use 74 school buses and drivers, and we drive over 1 million miles over the course of a year. And our students are spread out, few and far between. So a bus driver might drive 25, 30 miles out of town to pick up his or her first driver, and then drive 3 or 4 miles to pick up the very next student. I said driver, but I meant to say student. And maybe drive another 2 or 3 miles to pick up his or her next student. We don't have high-rise buildings in most of our districts' stops or areas outside of town. So because we're so sparsely populated, over 824 square miles, we lose money because we drive so many miles every day and every year. Last year, we lost $750,000 because the formula for transportation just wasn't enough. If you look at the right side and the left side in the blue areas, You can see that Minneapolis-St. Paul receives about 50% more per student in special ed. And on the left, it says that they recently received a 25% higher bump or increase in the pupil formula for schools. So it's very challenging, and a lot of this has to do with legislators coming from metro areas and lobbyists coming from the metro, and there's this metro mindset, which oftentimes leaves rural school districts in the dark or in the cold, if you will. So Bemidji is different than most metro schools because of some of these rural concerns. But special education, as you can see there, we lost $4.5 million last year. Most school districts do lose money in special ed, but most don't lose as much as we do, which is a huge amount, 4.5 million, considering our enrollment. The next item, transportation cross subsidy, is what I just talked about. The cross subsidy means we are needing to subsidize our busing programs every year because they run in the red. And that was $750,000 last year. We need to pay a competitive salary to attract and retain our employees. Otherwise, we lose very good people, and that affects the quality of our school district. And finally, some of our measures of poverty are changing. Our free and reduced rates are changing, and because of that, we often are finding that our aid packages that we receive from the state and the federal government are going down. Last year, we lost over $400,000 because our free and reduced rates are going down. So keeping up with these changing landscapes of school funding is very challenging, and it's very hard when the funding just isn't there to support our programs. The state of Minnesota has a constitutional requirement that mandates the legislature must support education. But that constitution does not require that the state of Minnesota fully fund all of its mandates. So there are many programs the state can require schools to do, but they don't have to fully fund them, and many of them are in the red. And that's one of the reasons we have challenging budget problems. So hopefully nobody has a headache yet. I've been rambling on here about a lot of very specific but confusing and difficult to understand scenarios in school budgets. And it is a challenge. It is very, very complicated. But I'm just at this point scratching the surface. I'd like to go a little bit deeper now into some of our funding situations and concerns. As anybody who runs a budget knows, whether a business or a household budget, if you spend more than you take in, you're going to be in the red. And that's where we were last year. And it's not because we were being irresponsible with our spending. It's not a spending issue. It's because we are mandated to do certain programs like busing and like special education, food service, but the revenue is not enough to cover those mandated programs. So last year, we lost $1.4 million, and we are projecting greater losses every year for the next 4 or 5 years. And you can see on the right side of the screen how much we're going to lose in 3 or 4 short years. So what happens is we are spending down our budget reserves, or our savings account, if you will. And once we get to the point where we're at zero and then begin to go into the red, once we're in the red by about 5%, $3.4 million, we enter what's called statutory operating debt. And once we're in SOD, the state can step in and start requiring us to take drastic action. They will begin telling us what to cut in terms of programs or classes. We don't want that to happen. So that is why we're trying very hard to figure out a way to find more funding. We had hoped that we would have more time. We were projecting that we might be in this statutory operating debt in about 2 years. But COVID came along and greatly compounded the problem. And now it's looking like before this school year is over, we might be that much in the red. So what can school districts do when we are faced with situations of budget shortfalls like we are right now? There are 4 strategies. If you start with the one in the yellow on the bottom, that's what we've been doing quite a bit lately over the last 5 or 6 years, reducing our expenditures. But we really can't do that much more because we've already cut and taken a lot of the low-hanging fruit. And we cannot continue to cut our way to success. That's another one of my mottos. No school district has ever figured out a way to find success through making cuts. At this point in time, we don't want to cut technology because of our distance learning situation. We don't want to cut activities because students need those to stay connected. So cutting is really not an option anymore. As we move to the left, we can look at ways that we can increase state funding through working with our legislators. And I lobby down at the state capitol every year. But right now, most legislators are telling me, we would like to help you. We would like to help school districts, but there's no money at the state level. So that's not really an option. At the top, we can continue to attract and keep new students in our district, but that is a very difficult project to undertake, and we can't be very successful at doing that if we are making cuts in our programs. So basically that leaves us with the operating levy, the fourth option, which is on the far right. And that is why we are going out for an operating levy at this time, because we've looked at all of the three other strategies and none of those are viable for us at this point in time. So right now we have a 6-year-old operating levy that's $180 per student. And when you see how that compares to some of the peer school districts that are similar to Bemidji in size, you can see how it compares to Austin and Wilmer, which are smaller, but the other districts are larger and in some cases quite a bit higher. Moorhead and Alex and Faribault and Winona. And Winona is a school district and the community which is most similar to Bemidji. It's a county seat, it's a college, university town. The size of the community is similar to Bemidji. But one thing that's different is that it has a higher tax base. So it can afford that kind of an operating referendum. Where we're at right now is quite modest in comparison to those peer districts. So the specifics of our referendum levy is that we are asking, if you see the third column there on the screen, we are asking for an additional $280 on top of the current $180 operating referendum, which is 6 years old. Now, because that current 180 referendum is 6 years old, it's going to expire in just 4 short years. And we don't want to go back to the community in 4 years and ask again for a new referendum. So at this time, our proposal is to revoke that $180 per pupil referendum and roll it back into the new $280 request for a total of $460. And what that will do is net us about $1.5 million new dollars every year over the next 10 years. And it will reduce our projected deficit by 72% over the next 3 years. So a little bit of increase is going to go a long way towards providing us some more revenue. What will this mean for tax implications for you as a taxpayer? Right now, if you look at inside the box at that first column, that $180 existing current referendum in red, if you have a house that's valued at $100,000, you are currently paying $28.89 a year, less than $2 a month for the current $180 referendum or levy. The additional that we are asking for on the right side of $280 per student is only $44.95 more a year. So that's what's nice about this. It's an additional $280 per student, but it only costs a taxpayer on a $100,000 home $44.95 a year, less than $4 a month, or what I like to say, less than a cup of latte or cappuccino at Canterbury Coffee Shop. If you have a house valued at $200,000, it would be double that amount. But I hope that people see this as a worthwhile investment in the future of the school district and in the future of our community. What happens if the operating levy does not pass in the referendum? Then we'll be forced to go back to those other 3 options I talked about a few minutes ago. We might have to make more cuts, which will result in larger class sizes, fewer support services for students, and reduced student activities. And here's where I would like to reiterate and repeat, we cannot cut our way to success. So our next steps are to continue having community conversations, to continue seriously working on our financial planning, and to begin to ask that question, what happens if the state dollars continue to fail us if the pandemic continues? And to seek some help from local leaders and ask for people to step up and advocate for the school district and ask how they can help. My hope is that people will see that this is a good and worthwhile investment in the future of our community, because a strong school district means a strong future for a strong community. I like to believe that our ancestors were bold when they came to this country and when they set up an educational system in Minnesota like they did. I would also like to think that we still believe in being bold and that we can move boldly into the future on behalf of Bemidji area schools. That is why we are going out for a referendum. That's how much it is, $280 additional. And again, it's not going to amount to that much on a house that's worth $100,000 or $200,000. So at this point in time, we can have some questions that are frequently asked questions that come up quite often, and I will do my best to answer them.
Thank you, Superintendent Lutz, for presenting that. My name is Kaylee Fear, and I'm the parent and family educator with Bemidji School District, and I'm helping co-facilitate this presentation. And so we've gathered some frequently asked questions, speaking with community members and receiving information in. And a lot of it was answered in the PowerPoint, but we'll just elaborate on some of them. So the first question is, what would the justification be for supporting this referendum when many students are currently learning from home in a distance learning model or a hybrid model?
Well, you know, that's a good question. And a lot of times people think that we aren't in session and that teachers aren't working if students are learning from home. But teachers are actually working anywhere from 30% to 70% longer days and overall that much harder as they're working with students in the hybrid model or in the distance learning model. It is very challenging to learn new techniques and new technology and to reach out to these students who are at home. It takes a lot of organizational skills and a lot of effort to prepare lesson plans and to record them and to do a lot of the work ahead of time. So school is still in session. It is a lot more challenging for everyone, but it's not like thinking that school is not happening. It definitely is, and it's much more challenging.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jason Luxick. I am the other co-facilitator. I work as the Lincoln Elementary principal, and I also have 4 children in the district and a taxpayer as well. So one of the questions that we have is for Mr. Lutz is, due to COVID, many businesses in our community are facing budget cuts as well. Why should voters support the referendum versus the school district making cuts?
You know, again, I want to reiterate that the cuts are something that we have done for about 5 or 6 years in the past, and we will continue to look at cuts that we can make. But the issue isn't so much that we are being irresponsible with our spending or that we're overspending on purpose. It is that the state is requiring us to conduct various mandates and to carry them out, like transportation and food service and special education, but they're not funding schools in Minnesota to the degree that they need to in order for us to be successful and to pay for these programs. So when people often say they have to live within their means, and so does every family and every business, why can't the school district do that? My simple answer to that is, for Bemidji area schools and many other school districts in Minnesota, the means aren't really there. The funding that we need isn't sufficient and it's not really there. So that's the reason why we have to go out to the community to ask for additional support. And no superintendent, no school board likes to do that, but right now that is our only option, that we have to go out and ask for local help because the state and the federal government aren't taking care of it like we need them to.
Thank you. The next question we've heard a lot is, if this referendum does not pass, which you covered in your slide showing the statutory operating debt, where would the majority of funding be cut? What cuts would happen?
Well, at this point, I can't stipulate or say exactly for a couple of reasons. One is we usually need to wait until February, March, or April to see where we're at with our budget and to see where we're at with our programs, and then we begin to make those decisions. Another reason I hate to answer that is because whenever I do, it sounds like I'm making threats, and I don't like to do that. But what I can say is that more than likely, some of the cuts will be in programs where students perhaps aren't in large numbers. So if there's a class that doesn't seem to have a lot of students, that class might be cut. And unfortunately, that leaves a class out of the picture. It's out of our schedule, no longer available, that some students might have felt was their favorite class. In other areas, we might have to cut a teacher or two in a school building, which will then result in larger class sizes, which is one of the most efficient ways to cut spending, but it results in larger sizes, and a large classroom is very challenging for a teacher, and it's not an ideal situation for students to learn in. So those are some examples. We might also end up having to cut student support services, and that's a very difficult proposition in a time when we're dealing with a pandemic and we have a lot of mental health issues in families, and I would hate to see us need to cut student support programs at this time. So those are some examples. We might even have to cut some music programs or sports programs. And I don't like to bring that up, but the classroom is actually more important, I think, when it comes to a school than some of these programs. And those are just some examples of what might be on the cutting block.
Thank you. The next question is, how will funds that are received from the referendum be used?
I can gladly say that funds from the referendum will be going mostly into the classroom. They'll go into programs and they'll go into classes where we have many students right now, and perhaps we can reduce some of those class sizes. That's one of our goals, is to keep class sizes relatively small or to shrink some of them so that there's a smaller ratio of teachers to students. They'll also go into support services for students and into technology for students. All of the money that's coming in will eventually go into supports and programs and classes and academic initiatives for students. They will go towards classrooms and they'll go towards students. And that's where we want our funding to go.
And Superintendent Lutz, how is that audited for proper use?
You know, I've heard that question before about having audits or forensic audits in order to guarantee and to show where our funding is going. And I can say that we are given a forensic audit every single year. Auditors come in every year and make sure that we are spending the funding that we receive in the proper way through the proper channels, and that restricted funds go into restricted programs, and that all of the other funds are spent legally and properly and based upon the mandates and the statutes of the state of Minnesota and of the federal government.
Thank you. Our next question is, does the referendum help pay for all-day, everyday kindergarten and early childhood programming?
Yes, it does. Those are two examples of very important programs, because those programs go into the earliest learners, and the sooner and the better we can support the needs of our youngest learners, the better we will be down the road. When younger students learn, and when our youngest students are given the supports they need, their learning is so much more effective and efficient and rapid. It's much easier to teach a 4, 5, and 6-year-old student than it is an 8 or 9-year-old student. By the time they're 8 or 9, they are more and more hardwired, and it's more and more difficult to teach concepts like reading and math and science. So the earlier we can invest in our children, the better. But unfortunately, our early learning and our kindergarten all day, every day programs are a couple of examples of mandates and programs that are not fully funded. So definitely referendum dollars will help to support these younger learners.
Mr. Lutz, you talked a little bit about in your slideshow this question, but do other districts that are comparable to us in size, like Brainerd, Detroit Lakes, and Moorhead, have referendums this big?
I can speak for Moorhead, and they do have a referendum, an operating referendum that's amounts to more dollars per student than we have. And if you remember from that slide, it was $100 or $150 more per student. I can also speak to Brainerd, which has a bond referendum of $205 million right now. So they've got quite a large referendum out there that's in existence in Brainerd. So yes, those two school districts do. I can't speak for Detroit Lakes off the top of my head because I'm not quite sure what they have. But if they're like most school districts, the great majority of districts in Minnesota do have operating referendums going because the state just doesn't fund education like it should.
Thank you. And this is my last question that I have, which you touched on in the PowerPoint. But what is the actual cost for a taxpayer if the referendum passes? And how long would they expect to pay this cost?
Yeah, again, if it's a house that's valued at about $100,000, the amount would be under $4 a month or $44.95 a year. If a house is valued at $150,000, that is about $5.61 per month. And the operating referendum that we are proposing is a 10-year levy, so it would last for a full decade. But when you think about the investment and what you get for it, that on a $100,000 house, that $4 or so a month will result in another $280 per student or $1.5 million a year. So it's, in my mind, a really strong bang for your buck in terms of an investment.
Thank you. And so Superintendent Lutz, if viewers are watching this and have further questions or need clarification on anything, what would be the best way to contact the school district to get those answers?
Thank you for asking that. I'm going to go back to the previous slide here and make sure people do know that I'm more than willing and I'm very happy to take questions. So there's my contact information through email and also my phone number. And we also have on all of our websites, and in particular our district website, a Let's Talk button. If you click on that, that'll also open up a portal where you can submit a question or a comment. But I'm more than willing, I welcome the opportunity to visit with people about the referendum and to answer any questions that they might have. And I think at this time, I would like to once again thank people for watching this slideshow and listening to my presentation and for taking part in listening to the questions and perhaps submitting some of these questions at some point in time. I do hope that this presentation has been helpful, but again, if not, if you still have some questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me. Thank you for watching.